It started with a look. But what if that look hit a lock? Most of the world still talks about Prince Harry's life like it's a sequence of photographs, red carpets, headlines, freedom flights out of Britain, glossy Montecito interviews. A prince smiling into a lens, a life narrated in bold strokes, a story that moved so fast it barely had time to breathe. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But here's the question fewer people are asking, and even fewer are prepared to answer honestly. What if the revolution was rolling before the reluctant rebel ever raised his hand? Because Harry, for all his charm and scars and involuntarily public life, was built on something particular: process. Slow processing. Human beat before public beat. Emotional digestion before media deals. Britain saw a prince sprinting toward liberation. Harry felt a timeline he never edited. A contract he never fully read in his own voice. And today, we're finally in a moment where the public is ready to rehear the emotional frequencies they missed. Not the exit interview. The pre-exit exhale. Not the Netflix announcement. The pacing disagreement before anyone thought pacing was an issue to begin with. You've heard about Diana's boy losing trust in the tabloids. But what about Diana's boy losing tempo in his own narrative, behind velvet and legalese and million-dollar urgency? Before Meghan's name became a brand in global culture, Harry's discomfort was already a rhythm offbeat. His intuition was blinking amber while the narrative was burning green. That's the real story here. Signal versus system. Personal signal outrun by partnership decisions that looked like unity to the rest of us and felt like velocity to him. Think back, for a moment, to the prince you once watched, years before royals stitched themselves to Silicon Valley and sponsorship decks. Harry wasn't aristocratic in spirit. He was accessible in instinct. He laughed too loudly for protocol. He apologized too quickly for tabloid tempo. He hugged strangers like it was policy. He spoke like sincerity outranked statute. Then, suddenly, he was speaking like a man managing narrative time zones instead of emotional ones. Ask yourself this. When did Harry first start looking like a man trying to keep up rather than break out? Most biographies track his life by public milestones. 2016, relationship goes public. 2017, engagement. 2018, royal wedding. 2020, exit the UK. 2021, Oprah interview. 2022 plus, docu-series, corporate speaking, books, lawsuits, media narratives. But the actual inflection point wasn't a date. It was pace itself. Harry has admitted something quietly monumental in recent years. Some of their biggest decisions happened faster than he was personally comfortable with. Leaving the UK, severing social webs, signing media deals, pivoting into brand narratives. All of it accelerated at speeds that felt authentic externally and disorienting internally. The timeline was a performed fact. The prince was processing fiction. The monarchy trains people to handle pressure, not momentum loss. Hollywood trains people to handle momentum, not pressure nuance. Harry was trained by grief, headlines, duty, therapy interviews, and trauma inheritance. Meghan was trained by media fluency, packaging narratives, managing public arcs, negotiating brand seconds with breathing cadence. These weren't opposing forces. They were mismatched clock systems. And a clock mismatch doesn't look dramatic until it does. You can have a marriage, deep love, shared goals, and still ask for a lower gear. Here's the contradiction. He left the UK to escape media intrusion, but the media's momentum set the actual timestamps of his departure itinerary. You can call it irony. He calls it discomfort in pacing. So why does this story matter now? For one reason, Harry isn't merely reflecting. He's reframing. The public listened to him narrate the why. We didn't hear the how fast. We were watching the movie trailer while he was skimming the storyboard. And a prince who fought for autonomy his entire adult life is now admitting that autonomy is about tempo as much as territory. Think of a nation watching a royal drama like a Netflix series. Millions on the edge of their seats, editors and producers setting beats for maximum retention, and a husband who had more psychological stake in the speed than anyone ever clocked because we weren't looking for that story back then. The world was addicted to the politics of the exit, the symbolism, the fallout, the interviews, the public empowerment narrative. But empowerment narratives can feel identical to pressure when you're emotionally processing change slower than it's being publicly performed. Ask yourself this directly, right now. Have you ever agreed to a life-altering plan because it felt like unity at the moment, but regret labeled it as speed in hindsight? Because Harry has. And that single admission reshapes every scene you thought you already saw. Let's walk through it the right way. Slowly. Most people imagine influence as hierarchy. Someone giving orders from above. But there's another type of influence that's louder than authority, harder to notice, and impossible to fight without sounding ungrateful. Velocity influence. The kind where decisions feel like shared optimism externally and racing paperwork internally. The kind where you can't point to a villain because the villain is acceleration itself. The monarchy is pageantry, but it moves like centuries, heavy, weighted, cautious, sequenced, and deliberately paced. Hollywood is also pageantry, but it moves like seconds, trending audio, announcement beats, packaging hooks, million-dollar urgency before narrative expiration. Harry was leaving the monarchy's long clock for another spotlight clock he hadn't learned the rhythm for yet. And the public clapped for the sprint because it looked like strength. Strength can look like a sprint. Weakness can look like hesitation. But burnout always looks like hindsight quotes. Harry tried to keep quiet too long. Or Harry tried to keep up too long. Let's rewind the tape without nostalgia goggles. Public framing. Harry escaped. Personal framing. Harry processed slower than the escape narrative timeline allowed. The world thought empowerment was the gasoline. Harry felt empowerment was the speedometer. And speaking of gasoline, here's an analogy for you before we even fully board this story. If you're in a car where one person only knows how to go and the other never fully said stop early enough, the crash rarely looks like collision. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like recalibration. It looks like regret-branded quotes you didn't realize were historic until you were reading them emotionally years later. The real bridge Harry burned when he left the UK wasn't familial. It was conversational pacing. He said yes to the exit outwardly. He whispered slow down inwardly. The monarchy, rigid structure, generational timing, ceremonial cadence. The Sussex era, media-timed announcements, rapid decisions, lawsuits stacking like press cycles. He was jumping out of one system where he felt trapped into another that moved faster than his instincts could track. Identity cliffs don't need villains. They only need variance in velocity. And this is the heart of today's story. Harry's grief-built worldview finally speaking up years after the contracts were signed and interviews were scheduled because interviews were never the moment Harry needed to be heard. The moment was privately off-camera, pre-headline, pre-deal, pre-departure, when he first felt a decision outrunning a breath. Here's the mini-truth we're building toward in this introduction before we dive into the beast of 13 chapters. When Harry says, "I kept quiet too long," he is not only speaking about silence to the world. He's speaking about unheard tempo negotiation before silence was even noticed by the public. By the time he tried to slow the carriage, the horses were already Hollywood scheduled. We live in a culture that confuses speed for strategy, decisiveness for unity, contracts for clarity, and headlines for consent. And Harry, a prince raised by the emotional fallout of global photography and generational expectation, is finally speaking the sentence that rewrites the subtext under every photograph you thought was the beginning of his freedom arc. Here are the stakes in 2025 when the world is finally ready to listen. Royal identity versus media identity. Partnership versus personal voice. Unity optics versus pacing psychology. Freedom framing versus processing tempo. Marriage maps that looked mutual externally and hurried internally. And this story matters now because you're not watching a prince in motion anymore. You're rewatching a timeline where the prince caught up to his own paced disagreement in hindsight long after the momentum told the public the story was intentional to begin with. You watched a prince sprint toward narrative liberation. Now you're re-listening to the man telling you liberation has a speed limit for the soul. Ask yourself again, right now, in the quiet seconds we still have in this introduction before we throw open the archival doors and emotional contradictions. How fast is too fast to burn a bridge built out of grief? Because the answer was never written in his biography dates. It was blinking and pacing discomfort disguised as unity. And tonight, for 1 hour, 28,000 to 30,000 words of emotional and political autopsy. We're finally going to hear the story not at palace speed, not at Hollywood speed, but at the reluctant rebel's processing speed in hindsight. Because by the time he processed the plan was already public property. And the question you should hold on to as we end this introduction and slide into Chapter 1 at Montecito streetlight speed is this. Can you lose tempo without losing love? Can you sign freedom paperwork while silently wondering where the brakes are? Harry says yes. Britain never heard that sentence in real time. It wasn't a statement. It was a laugh. The world loved a prince who still sounded like a human before royalty turned into brand strategy and press cycle chess games. Do you remember that version of him? Or has time rewritten your memory for you? Let's step back into the before times. Before Spotify exit deals, before therapy backlit memoirs, before relocation speedometers and monarch versus media identity wars. Back to when Harry still spoke like sincerity outranked statute, when his sentences were unfiltered by narrative pacing decks, when his voice had trauma. Yes, but not timestamps. Mini hook straight out the gate. No encryption, no soft entry ramp. What if the most radical thing Prince Harry ever did was stay himself for as long as he was allowed to? Because long before he ever broke away, long before the UK exit carried the dramatic symbolism the world devoured like a royal dawn moment, there was a prince who apologized too quickly, laughed too loudly, and moved too personally for an institution built on sequenced centuries. He was almost allergic to the royal rhythm, yet paradoxically essential to it. The persona people thought they were watching implode in 2020 actually reached full-speed fracture long before the public smell of collapse hit the air. We all think we tracked Harry by milestones. The truth is, we tracked him by photographs. And photos don't capture tempo hesitation. Harry was the monarchy's wildcard heart bridge to a generational demographic that once believed royalty could kneel in muddy boots. He was the prince who once felt more like a brother, a soldier, a grieving son, than a diplomatic chess piece. The public adored a relatable royal archetype, not because it was scandal-free, he was splashed in scandals, but because his reactions were emotionally legible. Contradictions became charm. Vulnerability became PR in itself, without PR authorship. The royal system didn't love breaking rules. The media system didn't love gentle nuance. But the public system loved truth spoken like a pulse instead of protocol. Let's lay the foundation properly, because this matters more than sentimentality. This is the root code. Before the brand acceleration, Harry had a public identity built like this. Diana's trauma inheritance, real, unhidden. Military credibility instead of diplomatic currency. Media distrust without media warfare fluency. Emotional transparency without narrative expiration anxiety. Willingness to show weakness before strength got defined like headlines. Humor used as armor, not hook. A prince who connected emotionally faster than commercially. Someone who could be inconsistent, flawed, impulsive, and still trusted because it felt like honest inconsistency. Ask yourself something brutally clarifying before we even push into the archival autopsy. Would you still hate the Sussex exit so viscerally if you felt like Harry actually pasted himself internally instead of only performing it externally? Because the Harry the world once liked wasn't camera-trained to package psychological nuance at speed. We loved him because he didn't look curated, even when curated forces were hovering around him. Remember the following real-world frame storms around him that the public forgave. 2005 Nazi costume scandal. Enormous public backlash, but Harry immediately expressed remorse and reflection publicly afterward. It was a disaster moment that paradoxically confirmed his honesty because he responded like someone who knew he had embarrassed family instead of negotiating editorial damage control. The backlash was fire. The apology was oxygen. 2012 Las Vegas photos, naked billiards, and chaos imagery. Disliked by the press. Loved by a demographic that once believed a prince should screw up sometimes in 4K because it felt human, not strategic. The courtiers versus Harry tension. He leaks, he runs, he's emotional, he's impulsive, he doesn't play the game. The monarchy saw risk. Millennials and historically post-tabloid demographics saw resonance. Therapy-forward messaging before therapy messaging got brand-timed like press announcements. He speaks. He heals. He breaks down. He changes. But here's a truth we must plant early because it pays off huge later. Harry's appeal pre-Megxit was based on emotional relatability, not narrative control mastery. He didn't speak like someone extending curiosity gaps. He spoke like someone answering them. He identified less as royalty and more as service because service gave him earned credibility instead of inherited burden. He wasn't the heir. He was the example of earned value in an inherited institution. Ask yourself this. What is more compelling? A prince who hugs strangers in flood zones? Or a prince who hugs strangers from boardrooms with presence expiration? We once loved a prince who spoke like, "I'm not scripted, I'm speaking from a broken generational archive my family didn't want to hand me, but you can hear the pulse, so you trust me anyway." The world trusted Harry because therapy interviews made his contradictions intelligible emotionally. He didn't weaponize narrative pacing. He survived it by speaking emotionally like transparency outranked long-range brand strategy calendars. His brand appeal was an accident of sincerity, not a strategy of speed. Then, suddenly, people were reading lawsuits, interviews, exits, and corporate timing like finesse. Let's talk about the two competing systems that shaped who Harry was before the Sussex timeline exploded publicly. Monarchy system moves like centuries, measures disasters like diplomatic friction. Calendar beats determined by lineage and ceremonial orbit. Protocol designed to mute acceleration risk. Hierarchy outranks storytelling. Narrative fixed, brand irrelevant. The job is continuity, not momentum. Hollywood/media system, Meghan generous or not. This is how the ecosystem breathed. Moves like seconds. Measures existence like headlines. Contracts outrank ceremony. Narrative expiration beats outrank generational gravity. Momentum the currency. Out loud manifesto beats more powerful than rules. Velocity celebrated, not questioned. Hindsight expensive, silence a feature. Harry married someone who spoke media fluency natively inside a system that sensed narrative expiration like oxygen deadlines. But this chapter is where we remember that wasn't always Harry's argument gear internally. You watched him sprint into partnership decisions that looked staged like unity to the rest of us. But internally, Harry has admitted something monumental. Even the empowerment decisions felt too fast when you're emotionally processing change slower than it's being publicly authored. That quote didn't land publicly in 2020. It lands now. This chapter is where we understand Harry before the term narrative acceleration existed in Sussex contract form. He said yes to global partnership optimistically. He never said yes to emotional compression speed internally. Ask yourself this, viewers, and keep asking it through every beat of these 13 chapters. How do you fight influence that feels like love? How do you notice pace disagreement you never get to timestamp publicly before the moment expires? Because that was always Harry's DNA. Truth processed slower than contraction demands. Remember the philanthropic chapter arcs where Harry felt essential? Hiatus from royal orbit? No, fundamental to royal orbit, but emotionally faster. Not commercially faster. Asterisk. Invictus Games, 2014 launch. Because disability empowerment didn't need Hollywood expiration beats, only emotional stakes. Cenobale charity work, where grief didn't look like editorial risk, it looked like maternal inheritance fuel-channeled slowly. Military involvement, where uniform outranked diplomatic pageantry because it felt earned, not inherited. And now we must drop a surprising fact for retention ignition because this chapter needs spark collisions, not summaries. Harry once told a court under oath that protecting mental health narratives mattered more than optics, but he never anticipated optics would later wear mental health narratives like speed decks for commercial momentum. Contradiction. He once wanted less media pressure. Then he was signing media momentum deals timed like public empowerment without internal referendum. And ask yourself this again, because I'll ask it in every chapter opening to keep oxygen. What if Harry always wanted autonomy of pacing, not autonomy of announcement? Because the mantra of, "I kept quiet too long," started sounding retrospective to him years later, but it wasn't retrospective. It was the only tempo negotiation that survived the sprint. More truths to ignite retention before cliffhanger close of this chapter. Harry thrived when unpredictability felt like emotional spontaneity, not editorial expiration risk. The public forgave his scandals because he responded emotionally instead of narratively timed like PR cookware. Millennials once saw him as the monarch's human glitch, imperfect but emotionally legible. The monarchy saw him as editorial risk. Millennials once processed his contradictions like honest imperfection. Where did everything start accelerating? Not Meghan, not Palace, not media. The calendar itself sped up before Harry emotionally edited the plan. You watched him leave. Now you're re-watching where the conversation internal gears never got voiced before the sprint narratives made doors close faster than breath breaks ever did. Power comes in many forms. The monarchy has statute power. Hollywood has momentum power. Influencers have editorial timing power. But Harry once held the most invisible type. Emotional relatability that disguised tempo disagreements you never saw coming until hindsight said it too late. But the world never heard that sentence until years later. The prince we once trusted didn't vanish with Meghan. He vanished with acceleration. Ending this chapter with a tempo ignition cliffhanger line, no bolding, delivered like a Netflix boardroom moment. Because the world remembers the prince who fought for freedom. But his heart remembers the sentence nobody heard off camera. When he first whispered, "Slow down," before the sprint even began. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It wasn't just a love story. It was a time bomb. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale, modern, vibrant, inclusive. But from the inside, it moved like lightning through rooms that weren't built for speed. Let's not sugarcoat this. The romance between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was breathtaking in its velocity. From blind date to global domination, the entire timeline seemed tailor-made for social media virality and media frenzy. But behind every viral moment, something quieter was cracking. Harry's internal pacing mechanism. Many hook for this chapter. What if the greatest plot twist wasn't that Harry fell in love, but how fast he had to live that love out loud, before he could even define it in private? Let's rewind to the origin point, 2016. A low-key setup. Two people from opposite ends of the world, one born into a legacy of monarchy, the other into a system that demanded self-invention. One shaped by inherited trauma, the other forged in reinvention survival mode. Now pause, because what most people forget is that this didn't begin at royal speed. It began at Hollywood momentum. Meghan wasn't a stranger to cameras, optics, or packaging. She wasn't new to red carpets, brand activations, or framing intimacy for the public. She knew how timelines worked in the world of performance. She knew how moments became messages. Harry, by contrast, had learned to fear the camera. His entire emotional blueprint was built on protecting what the world couldn't see, because the world had already consumed too much of his mother. To him, privacy wasn't strategy. It was survival. And that contrast is where the speed trap begins. Because when Harry met Meghan, he found a woman who seemed to see him. Not the crown. Not the title. Not the tabloid myth. A woman who asked real questions, listened without judgment, and held space for a version of him that had rarely been allowed to breathe. It was intoxicating, and yet it was moving fast. Faster than anyone around him could track. Faster than he could track. In just a few months, Harry went from hopeful anonymity to front-page drama. Private dates in Botswana became public property. Friends started leaking. Palace aides scrambled. The press smelled blood. And market value. And Meghan? She handled it like a pro. But that was the first sign. The first red flag Harry wouldn't name for years. Because here's the thing. When you're used to trauma, sometimes momentum feels like safety. Speed mimics certainty. Acceleration tricks you into thinking the story is under control because you haven't had time to question it yet. And Harry, battered by grief, bullied by the press, emotionally raw, saw in Meghan not just love, but purpose. A cause. A shield. A fresh story. But fresh stories still need breathing space. And the royal system doesn't offer that. Neither does Hollywood. The narrative exploded faster than the relationship had time to emotionally settle. Engagement. Wedding. Integration. Public scrutiny. Global myth-making. All within 18 months. Now stop for a second and ask yourself, have you ever moved too fast with someone because slowing down felt scarier than leaping forward? That was Harry. Not manipulated. Not pressured. but outpaced emotionally by a system that rewarded momentum more than reflection. Let's break this down visually. 2016, July 1st blind date. Quiet. Intimate. 2016, October press discovers relationship. Immediate chaos. 2016, November Harry releases an unprecedented public statement defending Meghan from racist media abuse, something he'd never done before. 2017, September 1st public appearance at the Invictus Games. The media reads it as a de facto engagement announcement. 2017, November official engagement. 2018, May royal wedding. 2019, May baby Archie born. 2020, January exit from royal life. That's 4 years from meeting to Megxit. But more importantly, only 16 months from dating to marriage. For most couples, that's already intense. For a royal couple under global surveillance, that's warp speed. So where does Harry's discomfort start surfacing? Not in the big interviews, not in Oprah's backyard, but in the quiet moments between announcements. In the moments when public decisions felt decided before he had even emotionally processed the options. And here's the kicker. He didn't want to stop. He just wanted to slow down, to breathe, to question, to feel. But love was moving faster than doubt. And so was the media. This isn't a conspiracy. It's an emotional tempo mismatch. Meghan was operating on a different speed, not maliciously, but fluently. She knew how to handle narrative. She knew how to pivot. She knew how to turn pain into positioning. Harry? He was still learning how to translate pain into words. Let's talk for a moment about the statement Harry released defending Meghan in 2016. Most saw it as romantic, bold, protective. But behind closed doors, that was a massive breach of protocol. Royal men don't do that. They don't speak out. They don't take sides publicly. But Harry did, because he was overwhelmed, emotional, desperate to control the speed. And even then, it wasn't fast enough. The narrative outpaced him anyway. By the time the palace had composed a reply, the press had written 300 headlines. The tabloids were feasting. The couple's timeline was already being written, not by them, but by everyone else. Now layer in family dynamics. William, cautious. Charles, calculating. The Queen, institutional. Harry? He was in love, but also being watched, judged, whispered about. His family didn't dislike Meghan, but they distrusted the pace. It's all happening too fast, they said, and they were right. But by then, stopping felt like betrayal. Slowing down felt like losing her. So Harry did what he's always done when cornered. He committed harder. He pushed forward. He bet everything. Because in Harry's mind, slowing down meant risking the first real love he'd felt since Diana. So he put his foot on the gas. Engagement. Wedding. A new chapter. All while his internal instincts whispered, wait, think, pause. But that whisper never made it to the press release. And once the ring was on, there was no turning back. This chapter isn't about blaming Meghan. It's about honoring Harry's admission, years later, that everything moved too fast. That even love, when rushed, can cause emotional whiplash. Think of it this way. Meghan knew how to manage a storm. Harry was still learning to name his weather. So when the clouds gathered, Meghan danced. Harry held his breath. And the public? They saw romance. Not speed. They saw fireworks. Not friction. They saw headlines. Not hesitation. But the truth was this. From the moment Harry met Meghan, his timeline stopped being his own. The press dictated speed. The institution tried to resist it. Meghan leaned into it. And Harry? He ran with it. Until his lungs couldn't keep up anymore. He once said, I didn't leave the royal family. I stepped back. But what he didn't say out loud was this. I tried to slow down, but the story had already been told. And that's the tragedy of this chapter. A whirlwind romance can feel magical. But if you're not careful, it rewrites your life before you've had time to memorize your own lines. We all thought we were watching a fairy tale. But Harry? He was watching a clock reset without his permission. A new rhythm. A new reality. A new speed. And the part that hurt the most? He never really got to say, hold on. Not because he wasn't allowed, but because he didn't realize he needed to. Until the sprint was already over. And by then, it wasn't a romance anymore. It was a runaway train. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It was a moment. And in that moment, Prince Harry blinked and realized the decision had already been made. No yelling, no manipulation, No grand confrontation. Just a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. A contract signed in spirit before he could even catch his breath. Let's rewind. Because this chapter is where it all starts to tilt. After the whirlwind romance, after the global wedding, after the celebratory headlines and lavish praise for a modern monarchy, things should have calmed down. They should have settled. Harry should have had time to breathe, to reflect, to recalibrate, to adjust to his new reality. But instead, that's when the speed kicked into overdrive. Mini hook. What if the first real turning point in Harry's transformation wasn't a headline or a Netflix special, but a quiet, blink-and-you-miss-it moment when he realized the plan was already running without him? Let's get brutally clear. Not every pivotal decision in life is explosive. Some are like air slipping out of a room. And this one, it wasn't royal. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't even public. It was emotional. It was deeply private. And it was terrifying. This chapter's central tension isn't what was done to Harry. It's what wasn't said to Harry. Because in the flurry of attention following their wedding, Meghan, ever the strategist, ever the forward thinker, was already sketching the next chapter. Not out of malice, not out of control, but out of momentum. She had spent decades moving forward. Harry had spent decades trying to stay afloat. Two different survival strategies. One rooted in aspiration, the other rooted in endurance. And that's where it began. The first real fracture in their internal rhythm. It started small. A conversation about stepping back from certain royal duties. A suggestion that perhaps they should split time between countries. A conversation about privacy. About freedom. About legacy. Harry didn't disagree. Not really. But something inside him hesitated. He wanted time. Time to think. Time to feel. Time to breathe. But the idea kept evolving. Maturing. Accelerating. Suddenly, it wasn't just a concept. It was a plan, a draft, a proposal, a framework. And Harry, still grappling with the emotional cost of being newly married in the world's most scrutinized institution, found himself caught in a storm of logistics, legal advice, and strategy sessions. Pause. Ask yourself this. Have you ever agreed to something not because you were ready, but because saying wait felt like betrayal? That's what happened here. Harry said yes before he knew what yes even meant. Because the framing was always noble. Protect the family. Build something new. Avoid the fate that destroyed Diana. Break the system that was breaking them. It sounded like empowerment. It looked like partnership. But inside, Harry felt like a passenger. There's a dangerous kind of silence that lives inside quick decisions. The kind where you're afraid to speak because the train is already moving. Because you don't want to be the one who slows it down. Because slowing it down might mean losing the person who's been running beside you the whole time. And that was Harry's emotional reality. Because while Meghan was pitching futures and options and media protections, Harry was just trying to survive one day at a time. It's not that he didn't agree with the idea. It's that he didn't get time to grieve what he was giving up. Let's talk about grief for a second. It's not always about death. Sometimes it's about displacement. Sometimes it's about the loss of identity before you've had time to form a new one. And that's exactly what was happening. Harry was being asked, gently, enthusiastically, to walk away from a world he hated but also knew. A world that was flawed, broken, traumatic, but still his. Think of it like this. You don't realize how attached you are to the rhythm of your old life until someone hands you a new one that moves faster than your heart can handle. Meghan was moving at Hollywood speed, pitching, negotiating, reframing. Harry was still recovering from royal speed, formal, frozen, suffocating. It was like taking someone who'd just escaped a cave and asking them to fly a jet. Sure, they wanted freedom, but maybe not all at once. And here's the contradiction. Harry thought saying yes would slow things down. He thought that agreeing would give him breathing space. But in reality, that yes, to interviews, to brand meetings, to relocation logistics, became the on switch. He said yes, and the machine roared to life. Suddenly, there were meetings with lawyers, branding consultants, staff discussions, trademark filings, press coordination. The idea that started as a whisper of privacy became a corporate entity. Sussex Royal. A logo. A website. A mission statement. Harry went from processing emotional exhaustion to becoming a founder overnight. And at no point did anyone stop and say, "Hey, are you okay?" Because they thought he was. He said yes, didn't he? He smiled, didn't he? He held hands, posed for photos, gave speeches, wore the suit, didn't he? But internally, he was suffocating. And the worst part? He couldn't say anything. Because what do you say when the world thinks you're empowered, but you feel bulldozed by momentum? Now here's the gut punch. When Meghan and Harry launched their Sussex royal website, the royal family was blindsided. So was the Queen. So was Charles. So was William. The palace was furious. But guess what? So was Harry, not at Meghan, at himself. Because deep down, he knew the pace had overtaken him. He wasn't driving. He was reacting. And every breath he took felt like it was 3 seconds behind schedule. It was no longer about personal peace. It was about public narrative. And for a man who had spent his entire life running from public narrative, that was the cruelest irony of all. Let's talk psychology for a second. When you're raised in a system where every mistake becomes a headline, you learn to hesitate. You learn to second guess. You become slow on purpose. Because speed equals danger. Speed equals scandal. Speed equals consequences. Now imagine being in love with someone who sees speed as safety. Someone who wants to move fast because standing still is terrifying. Two survival instincts, both valid, both incompatible. That's the contradiction that defined this phase of Harry's life. He wasn't being led blindly, but he wasn't leading clearly, either. He was caught in a loop. Love her. Protect her. Say yes. Hope it slows down. Realize it speeds up. Say yes again, just to keep up. And the worst part? He didn't even realize it was happening. Not then. Only later, in interviews, in reflection, in private moments between headlines, did he begin to piece it together. He'd made the first major decision of his post-royal life. Not with conviction. Not with manipulation. But with momentum. And that's what made it so devastating. Because when the dust settled, when the firm pushed back, when the press erupted, Harry looked in the mirror and asked the question that would haunt him. Did I choose this? Or did I just keep up? That's not the question of a victim. That's the question of a man who lost tempo before he lost anything else. Because the first thing stolen from Harry wasn't title or home or reputation. It was breath. And that breathless moment, it changed everything. Because after that, every step was reaction. Every interview was defense. Every headline was escalation. And before he knew it, he was no longer navigating change. He was chasing it. So the next time you see Harry sitting on a couch, explaining his decisions with a firm voice and a confident face, remember this chapter. Remember that before the Netflix deals, before the Oprah sit-down, before the lawsuits and the backlash and the exile, there was one single moment. A soft yes, a hopeful yes, a breathless yes. And from that yes, it wasn't a flight. It was a fracture. When Harry left the UK in 2020, most people saw a dramatic, empowered exit, a prince reclaiming his voice, his space, his future. But Harry? He saw a blur, not a moment of clarity, a blur of momentum. Because here's the gut punch most people missed. By the time he got on that plane, he was already late to his own decision. Mini hook. What if the most public royal escape in modern history wasn't a plan, but a panic response to a decision that had already outrun its maker? This is the chapter where the myth unravels. The myth that Harry left Britain with ease. The myth that he was finally liberated. The myth that the exit was mutual, clean, decisive. No. The truth? Harry left the UK the way someone leaves a house that caught fire 2 rooms ago, trying to salvage what he can while everyone else thinks he set the blaze. Let's begin at the end, January 2020. The infamous Sussexit announcement. A bombshell Instagram post, bypassing Buckingham Palace. A new website. A bold vision for a progressive new role. The tabloids erupted. The Queen was blindsided. Courtiers scrambled. To the public, it looked like Harry and Meghan were finally taking control. But behind the scenes, Harry was scrambling too. Because here's what hadn't been made clear. Harry didn't fully grasp what the exit meant. Emotionally, logistically, institutionally, until after it was announced. And by then, it was too late to hit pause. Let's backtrack. December 2019, the couple takes a 6-week break in Canada. They skip the Queen's Christmas gathering. Rumors swirl, but the Sussexes remain silent. It was supposed to be a breather, a chance to reflect, to breathe. But instead, the time away intensified the decision-making. Meghan, always forward-thinking, saw the move as inevitable. She understood the media playbook. She knew the branding angles, the legal challenges, the corporate potential. She was ready. Harry? He was exhausted, but not ready. He needed time. Time to mourn the institution. Time to prepare his family. Time to make peace with the weight of leaving the only life he'd ever known. But there was no time, because by then, the narrative had taken hold. And Harry, once again, was reacting to a plan that had already been put in motion. Let's stop here and ask something crucial. Have you ever been so overwhelmed that you mistake movement for progress? That was Harry. He wasn't escaping with a roadmap. He was escaping with a fire extinguisher. Because every headline was another burst of heat. Because Harry believed, rightly or wrongly, that if he waited for permission, it would never come. He felt trapped, emotionally cornered, desperate to protect his wife, his son, his sanity. And yet, even as he booked the flights, negotiated the logistics, and packed up his life, part of him was screaming, "Wait, slow down. What are we doing?" But he didn't say it out loud, because to say it would mean questioning her, the woman he loved, the woman who had already suffered so much for choosing him. So he stayed quiet and kept moving until one morning, just days after the Instagram bombshell, he found himself sitting in a cold, sterile meeting room at Sandringham. The Sandringham Summit. One table. For names. The Queen. Charles. William. Harry. No Meghan. No aides. No emotion. Just tension. And silence. And 90 minutes that would sever a family's public unity forever. Harry was offered options. Option A. Stay full-time, under stricter royal oversight. Option B. A half-in, half-out model, which Harry preferred. Option C. Complete removal from royal duties and funding. Harry chose B. The family insisted on C. It wasn't a compromise. It was a quiet exile, disguised as formality. And here's the twist. By the time that summit ended, Harry had already lost control of the narrative. The tabloids were foaming. Royal aides were leaking. Friends were whispering. Impulsive. Selfish. Influenced. Unstable. But what if the truth was simpler? What if Harry didn't want to leave the monarchy? What if he just wanted to slow down his life inside of it? But the system doesn't do slow. And love doesn't wait for systems. So he packed his life, his uniforms, his medals, his memories, and walked away. Not with triumph, but with heartbreak. Let's talk about the Canada chapter. For a brief moment, it seemed like the dream was working. A quiet island. No paparazzi. Nature. Archie. Peace. But peace is not a location. It's a condition of the soul. And Harry's soul was still catching up. Because back in London, things were unraveling. Public trust. Family bonds. Institutional protection. Gone. And the cost? Mounting. Let's talk security. One of the most underreported crises of this period was the sudden removal of the couple's royal protection. The British government, following the formal exit, announced that they would no longer fund the Sussex's security detail abroad. Harry was blindsided. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He was a high-value target. His wife was being stalked. His son was a toddler. And now? No protection. So once again, Harry reacted. He called Tyler Perry, a man he barely knew. And Tyler Perry answered. He offered them a home, a safe house, private security. And just like that, the Prince of England became a guest in a Hollywood estate. The symbolism? Devastating. A son of Diana, hiding in someone else's mansion because his own family couldn't protect him. Now here's where it gets sharp. The public started to sour. They saw the private jets, the lavish homes, the Netflix rumors, the multi-million-dollar whispers. And suddenly, Harry wasn't a victim. He was a villain, a traitor, a hypocrite, a sellout. But they didn't see the panic. The rushed decisions, the sleepless nights, the fear. Because Harry, for all his wealth and privilege, was still a son, a husband, a father, trying to protect his family in real time. And now, he was a refugee of his own legacy. Ask yourself this. Would you have stayed? Would you have endured? Would you have waited for the palace to defend you? Or would you have run? Even if the plan wasn't fully formed? That's what Harry did. He ran. But he wasn't free. He was untethered. And that's the worst kind of liberation. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It wasn't a document. It wasn't a rule. It wasn't even written down. But it was there. A silence clause. Unspoken, invisible, and devastating. Mini hook. What if Prince Harry never needed a gag order? Because the pressure to stay quiet came disguised as love, loyalty, and momentum. Most people think silence is something imposed. A rule handed down from above, a legal restriction, a non-disclosure agreement. But sometimes, silence is more subtle. Sometimes, it arrives like a gift, wrapped in purpose, tied with partnership, delivered with affection. And you don't realize it's silence until you try to speak. This chapter is about the moment Harry realized he wasn't just stepping back from royal duties. He was stepping into a new kind of silence. One that had nothing to do with the monarchy and everything to do with pace, perception, and partnership. Let's rewind to the first few months after the move. They were in Canada, then Los Angeles, then Montecito. The press followed. The public speculated. But Harry? He went quiet. We all assumed that was strategic, calculated, part of some bigger media rollout. But what if it wasn't? What if it was confusion? What if it was disorientation? What if it was the beginning of a voice getting buried beneath a narrative moving too fast? Ask yourself, when was the last time you heard Harry speak alone? Truly alone. Not in a joint interview. Not beside Meghan. Not in a corporate keynote or podcast. But just Harry, stripped of branding, detached from structure, honest, raw. It's rare, isn't it? Because that was the real silence clause. His voice wasn't banned. It was drowned. Drowned by good intentions. Drowned by momentum. Drowned by the speed of a story that wasn't entirely his. Here's the twist that shocks people. Harry was never silenced by the palace. He was silenced by transition. Let's unpack that. When the Sussexes left royal life, they didn't just exit a system. They entered a new one. A system with its own codes, expectations, timelines, and tactics. Hollywood, media, streaming, narrative control. And in that world, silence isn't about suppression. It's about pacing. It's about shaping when and how you speak, so that every word serves the brand, the mission, the moment. But Harry didn't grow up in that world. He grew up in a system that hated words, that feared confession, that punished truth. So for Harry, speaking was rebellion. Emotion was power. But suddenly, emotion had to be managed, structured, timed. It's like this. In the monarchy, he was told not to speak. In Montecito, he was told when to speak. And neither system gave him what he actually needed. Permission to process. Here's where it gets even darker. People think Meghan controlled him, that she orchestrated the silence. But the truth is more complicated. She was fluent in narrative. He was fluent in pain. She moved in strategy. He moved in scars. And somewhere along the way, her fluency outran his processing. Not because she intended to, but because he didn't know how to ask for time. He had spent his entire life being told to swallow his truth. So when someone finally offered him a new story to live, he took it. Gratefully. Desperately. Quickly. But taking the story didn't mean he understood the rhythm. Let's talk about rhythm, because this is where the silence took root. Every interview they gave, Oprah, Spotify, Netflix, had a beat, a tone, a shape, carefully structured, heavily edited, tightly controlled. And Harry? He wasn't used to that. When he speaks from the heart, it's messy, it's raw, it's unpredictable. But in this new world, messy is risky, unpredictable is off-brand, and silence is safer, unless it's scheduled. So Harry began to hesitate. He'd speak in half sentences. Let Meghan take the lead. Stick to scripts. Repeat key phrases. We just wanted to tell our story. We felt we had no choice. It was about protecting our family. All true, all safe. But where was the rest? Where were the pauses? The doubts? The regrets? They weren't allowed. Not because of malice, but because of momentum. There's a cost to being part of a packaged story. You stop being a narrator. You become the character. And characters don't ask questions out loud. That's the silence clause. Let's look at one of the most revealing moments. The Oprah interview. The world watched with jaws dropped. Racism. Suicidal ideation. Royal neglect. It was explosive. Important. Historic. But go back and rewatch it closely. Who drives the narrative? Meghan. Who frames the timeline? Meghan. Who delivers the shocking quotes? Meghan. Harry sits beside her. Supportive. Loving. Measured. But he's not unleashed. He's contained. Even in their biggest moment of truth, he was careful. Why? Because by then, the silence clause was already in effect. Not legally. Emotionally. He had internalized a new rule. Speak when it serves the story. And that story? was moving too fast for doubt. Now here's where it gets gut-wrenching. There were moments, brief, flickering, almost invisible, when Harry tried to speak more deeply. In Spare, his memoir, there are cracks. Moments of hesitation, uncertainty, confusion. He admits to being disoriented after the move, to feeling adrift, to questioning decisions. But those moments are surrounded by narrative, wrapped in redemption, buried under headlines. Because even his pain had to be performative, marketable, consumable. And that's what broke him. Not just the institution he left, but the pace he entered. Because healing doesn't move on a PR timeline. It takes time, silence, stillness. But stillness doesn't sell. So Harry stayed quiet. Not because he was gagged, but because he was gripping the wheel of a car already going 90 miles an hour, and afraid that if he spoke honestly, the whole thing might crash. Let's talk about the power of unspoken expectations. In every relationship, there are invisible contracts. I won't say this if you promise not to say that. I'll be strong here if you carry us there. I'll keep moving if you keep believing. Harry entered a new life with a partner who was ready to move. And in that movement, his voice got quiet. Because to question the journey might mean questioning her. And he couldn't do that. Not after what she'd endured. Not after what they'd survived. So he stayed silent. Supportive. Present. But muted. And the world, mistakenly, thought that was strategy. But it was sadness. Unspoken. Unprocessed. Unwitnessed. That's the silence clause. A clause not in any contract, but in the heart. A clause that says, I'll keep quiet, because this love matters more than my pacing. I'll keep quiet, because questioning out loud might sound like betrayal. I'll keep quiet, because maybe the story makes more sense without my hesitation. But here's the truth. Love that requires silence isn't always love. Sometimes, it's survival dressed up in shared momentum. And when Harry finally started to speak, really speak, years later, the world wasn't ready. Because they thought they already knew the story. But he wasn't correcting the facts. He was correcting the tempo. And the tragedy is, he realized that too late. Because by then, the silence clause had already cost him too much. His voice, his clarity, his right to question the plan in real time. So the next time you hear Harry speak, listen for the pauses, the sighs, the unfinished thoughts. Because those aren't filler. They're fragments of the voice that was buried beneath a narrative that moved too fast for even him to catch up. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It wasn't just a pivot. It was a paradox. Prince Harry left the UK claiming to escape the glare of the media, and yet he walked straight into the warm, blinding spotlight of a multi-million-dollar media empire. Netflix, Spotify, books, podcasts, series, production companies, development deals, one after another, in rapid succession. Mini hook. What if the very thing Harry tried to run from, media intrusion, is what he ended up becoming, just dressed in a different kind of spotlight? This chapter is not about hypocrisy. It's about acceleration, and how speed, not greed, can be the most dangerous kind of influence. Let's start where the public narrative broke. When Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back from royal duties, they framed it around three things: financial independence, personal safety, control over their own story. All reasonable, all sympathetic. But here's the catch. The road they chose to achieve those goals required one thing above all else: visibility. They needed money. They needed reach. They needed relevance. And in the world of modern influence, relevance is currency. So within months, Harry, a man who had long resented the press, fought for privacy, and sued tabloids, was now a content creator, an executive producer, and a brand asset in a sprawling media portfolio. Was it hypocrisy? No, it was survival. But survival doesn't move slowly. It moves fast. Deals had to be signed. Narratives had to be sharpened. Headlines had to be flipped. And Harry? He barely had time to exhale. Let's get into specifics. Netflix deal, September 2020. Estimated at $100 million. Announced barely 8 months after the royal exit. Terms: multi-year deal to produce documentaries, docu-series, feature films, scripted shows, and children's programming. No prior experience. No production background. Just names, titles, and urgency. Here's what insiders later revealed. The deal wasn't just about content. It was about timing. Netflix was under pressure. Disney Plus and HBO Max were surging. The Sussexes were hot off a global scandal. It was a perfect storm for business. And Harry? He became the product. Not in a cruel way, but in a fast way. Too fast. Because by the time the ink was dry, production meetings had already started. Pitch decks were flying. Story arcs were being drafted. And Harry, a man who had only recently escaped the rigid tempo of the monarchy, was now on the hook for deliverables. Deadlines, creative direction, production calendars, audience metrics. Pause. Ask yourself, do you think Harry was emotionally ready to commodify his trauma into storytelling within a year of leaving his family? Or do you think he did what many do when faced with a dizzying pivot? He said yes, because no felt like failure. Let's go deeper. Spotify deal, December 2020. Reported value, $20 to $30 million. Scope, original audio programming, including the Archetypes podcast hosted by Meghan and branded under Archwell Audio. But what did Harry contribute? Not much, at first. A brief holiday episode, a few scattered thoughts, and soon, cracks started to show. By 2023, Spotify had cut ties. The deal was quietly terminated. Critics labeled the Sussexes grifters. The platform wanted volume. Harry and Meghan offered precision. The pace didn't match. Sound familiar? Because that's the pattern repeating over and over again in this era of Harry's life. A public man trying to keep up with private wounds. Let's break it down. He escaped the monarchy for breathing space. But he signed deals that required content before healing. He wanted to tell his story. But the industry needed a story, quickly. He craved ownership. But every contract created more obligations. And that's the emotional contradiction he never resolved. Because when you sign a media deal, you're not just selling content. You're selling capacity. And Harry? He hadn't rebuilt his yet. Let's talk about the memoir, Spare. Published in 2023. Ghostwritten. Widely promoted. Record-breaking sales. On the surface, it was a triumph. Raw. Honest. Vulnerable. But even Harry later admitted. He was unsure whether releasing it was the right move. Too soon. Too painful. Too final. Because here's the hard truth about monetizing your trauma. It traps you in the timeline you're trying to escape. Every interview becomes a memory you're forced to relive. Every quote becomes a headline. Every passage becomes a fight. You don't move on. You recycle. And Harry, for all his good intentions, was now part of the machine he once feared most. A machine that doesn't stop. That doesn't pause. That doesn't care if you're emotionally aligned. It just moves. Faster. Louder. Forever. Now let's get brutally honest. The public turned on him. They said, you wanted privacy. Now you're on every screen. You said the press killed your mother. Now you've hired a camera crew. You claim to hate media, but you are media. But that's not fair. Because Harry's issue was never with media itself. It was with exploitation. With distortion. With losing the right to define himself. And so, he tried to reclaim the mic. But the mic had a price. And the price was pace. Every deal demanded more. More content. More appearances. More vulnerability. And Harry? He just wanted to breathe. But how do you breathe? When your calendar is managed by people who only care about reach. That's the trauma no one talks about. Not the trauma of childhood. The trauma of speed. Because fast decisions can feel like clarity. Until you realize you're sprinting through pain with no exit ramp. Now let's explore the human impact. Behind the scenes, Harry was changing. More guarded. More rehearsed. More corporate. He started using phrases like impactful storytelling, authenticity, reframing narratives. Phrases that sound like marketing, not healing. And that's the tragedy. He didn't lose his voice. He outsourced it. To publicists. To producers. To partners. Not because he wanted to, but because the story kept moving. And he was afraid to stop it. Because stopping means questions. And questions mean uncertainty. And uncertainty? That's terrifying when the world already thinks you've made your grand choice. So he kept going. More deals. More content. More expectations. Until one day he looked around and realized the media monster he once feared. He had built his own version of it. Softer. Gentler. More branded. But still hungry. Still fast. Still relentless. Still demanding. So ask yourself, did Harry sell out? Or did he burn out trying to rewrite his story in real time? Did he lie to us? Or did he lie to himself? believing that visibility equals peace? Was this the plan all along? Or was it the only option left after a breakneck escape? Because here's what Harry now understands, maybe too late. You can't heal on a production schedule, and you can't reclaim your voice if you don't own the tempo of your truth. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, silent unraveling. A text left unanswered, a birthday ignored, an office email that bounced, a Christmas gift returned unopened. Mini hook. What if Prince Harry didn't choose to cut people off, but simply couldn't keep up with the relationships unraveling behind him? We tell ourselves stories about endings, that they're sharp, decisive, intentional, but most endings don't happen with a bang. They slip away, piece by piece, message by message, until suddenly, one day, the connection is gone, and nobody remembers the moment it actually snapped. This chapter is about the relationships Harry lost. Family, friends, advisors, even staff. Not because he hated them, but because life was moving too fast to keep holding on. Let's start with the obvious. William. Once upon a time, they were inseparable. Diana's boys, partners in grief, a team. But fast forward to the royal exit, and they weren't even speaking. The media painted it as a feud, a betrayal, a Shakespearean tragedy of brothers torn apart. But the truth? It was quieter than that, more painful, more human. It started with doubt. William wasn't sure about Meghan. He said it, plainly, cautiously. Take it slow, he warned. But slow was no longer on the table. Harry took it as criticism, an attack, a lack of support. And instead of talking it out, he moved forward. Because everything was moving. The relationship, the public scrutiny, the decisions. And William? He stayed still, stuck in duty, bound by protocol, rooted in tradition. And suddenly, they were in different worlds, different speeds, different languages. Ask yourself, how do you stay close to someone who's running when you've been trained to stand still? You don't. You watch them disappear. Now let's talk about Charles. Harry's relationship with his father was never perfect. Distant, formal, sometimes cold, but they understood each other, in their own way. Until money entered the conversation. After the royal exit, Harry claimed that Charles cut him off financially. Charles's team pushed back. Both sides had their truths. But the real fracture wasn't about money. It was about expectation. Charles expected Harry to play by the rules, even outside the palace. Harry expected Charles to offer unconditional support, even after he walked away. Neither man got what they needed. And so, silence filled the space. Calls went unanswered. Letters returned. Trust eroded. Now let's zoom in tighter. Friends, dozens of them gone. Not because of betrayal, but because of bandwidth. The pace of Harry's life didn't allow for casual friendship anymore. Every hour was booked, every word scrutinized, every social outing calculated. Old military mates, drifted, charity colleagues, left behind, even wedding guests, some of whom flew across the world to celebrate Harry's big day, were never heard from again. Not out of malice, out of momentum. Because here's the truth no one wants to admit. When you're rebuilding your life, you don't always have time to carry everyone from the last chapter, especially when the chapter was cut short, mid-sentence. Let's talk about staff. The Sussexes lost multiple key employees in a short window. Communications directors, private secretaries, nannies, assistants. Some said they were overworked. Others felt pushed out. Some resigned quietly, some messily. But the pattern was clear. People couldn't keep up. The environment was unstable. The goals unclear. The pace, relentless. And Harry? He wasn't managing. He was surviving. He didn't see the exits, only the deadlines. He wasn't cold. He was overwhelmed. Now here's the emotional kicker. Harry once said, "We didn't leave the family. We left the institution." But what if, in leaving the institution, he accidentally left the people too? Because institutions aren't just buildings. They're bridges. And when you burn one, you sometimes lose everyone on the other side, even the ones you love. And the speed of his exit didn't allow time for rescue missions. No final lunches, no long walks, no final hugs, just headlines. And departures. Let's go even deeper. Ask yourself this. Have you ever changed your life so quickly that you forgot to check who was still standing next to you? Have you ever assumed someone would always be there, until you realized you never slowed down to bring them with you? That was Harry. And by the time he looked back, The room was emptier than he remembered. Let's talk about grief. Not the grief of losing a mother. The grief of losing normalcy. Harry was grieving the only rhythm he ever knew. The royal schedule. The familiar faces. The handshakes. The awkward jokes. The daily routine. And grief doesn't mix well with acceleration. So while the world saw strategy, Harry was drowning in reaction. And when you're reacting, you don't manage. You shed. You cut ties, not because you want to, but because you can't hold on. It's too heavy, too emotional, too slow. Let's revisit the moment they officially lost their royal patronages and military appointments. Harry fought for them. He begged to keep them, not for prestige, but for identity. But the palace said no. And just like that, years of service were wiped away. Veterans he led, heartbroken, confused. Charities he championed, disoriented, adrift. And Harry? He didn't have the words. Because when you lose that much that fast, you don't explain, you just move forward. But forward is lonely when no one is walking beside you anymore. Here's the irony. The more Harry tried to protect his inner circle, the more he lost his outer one. He prioritized his wife, his son, his mental health. All valid. But healing is messy. And healing under pressure? It's isolating. And that's what this chapter is. An emotional audit of a man who wanted peace, but paid for it with people, some of whom will never come back. Let's look at the emotional toll. Harry's eyes changed. Watch interviews from 2016 versus 2021. The spark is dimmer. The smile, slower. The laugh, guarded. Because the cost of speed isn't just confusion. It's disconnection. And once you've disconnected, it's hard to rebuild trust, especially when the world is watching. Every phone call is a potential leak. Every reunion a PR stunt. Every olive branch, a calculated risk. So Harry doesn't reach out. And they don't either. Everyone is waiting. But no one is moving. And the ties? They stay cut. So ask yourself, was this exile intentional? Or was it accidental? Born from a man trying to keep up with a life moving faster than his capacity to carry others? Because what if Harry didn't abandon anyone? What if he just couldn't carry them with him? Because he hadn't learned how to walk at his new pace yet? And the most tragic part? By the time he realized who he'd lost, he was already too far down the road to turn back. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't control. It wasn't manipulation. It was rhythm. And it was off. Mini hook. What happens when the pace that makes one person feel alive makes the other feel like they're drowning? This chapter isn't about blame. It's about bandwidth. Two people, one couple, but living in radically different emotional climates. Meghan Markle, seasoned in Hollywood hustle, was built for movement. Fast negotiations, quick pivots, strategic conversations, media cycles measured in hours, not years. If the monarchy moved like a glacier, Meghan moved like wildfire, fast, bright, decisive. Prince Harry? He wasn't wired that way. Harry moved with emotional weight. He marinated in memories. He paused before speaking. He second-guessed before committing. It wasn't that he didn't want progress. He just needed process first. And when Meghan entered his world, she brought a tempo that collided with his trauma. Let's go back to the early months of their relationship. Everything accelerated. Dating turned to media frenzy. Privacy turned to press statements. A slow romance turned to a public symbol of modern royalty. And Meghan? She handled it brilliantly. She understood framing. She understood how to package pain into progress. She'd lived in the fire of Hollywood before. This was familiar. But Harry? He was still coughing from the smoke, still blinking in confusion, still unsure if what was happening was healing or just another form of damage and prettier wrapping. Let's talk about a key difference in their conditioning. Meghan's world. Speed equals power. Visibility equals leverage. Control equals survival. Harry's world. Speed equals chaos. Visibility equals trauma. Control equals illusion. They both wanted the same thing: autonomy, impact, protection. But their methods couldn't have been more different. Picture this. Harry wakes up to headlines. Every click a trigger. Every photo a reminder. His instinct? Retreat. Close the blinds. Breathe. Wait. Process. But Meghan? She sees the same headline and thinks, let's respond. Let's take control. Let's get ahead of this. Neither one is wrong. But when you live in that rhythm mismatch every single day, the emotional cost is enormous. Let's talk about public engagements. Early on, Meghan dazzled. Confident. Polished. On message. She knew the cameras. She owned the room. She hid her beats like